Good evening and welcome. The special called public hearing of the Cleveland County Board of Education to discuss the Shelby Zone realignment is called to order. And the first item we have is our invocation. We have Pastor Bo Wagner of Cornerstone Baptist Church. Pastor Wagner.
Heavenly Father, again, thank you so much for who you are and for all you've done, for how good you have consistently been to us. Thank you for another day of life you've given us. Lord, we didn't deserve it, but you were gracious to grant it to us. Lord, we're here tonight in a place where questions are asked and decisions are made, and I pray that wisdom will rule all of that. God, may you draw glory to yourself, and Lord, may nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but may each esteem other better than themselves. God, for everything you do, we'll continue to give you glory, for we know you alone are worthy. These things we pray in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor. Next, we have our Pledge of Allegiance. Mr. Hunt. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Next is adoption of the agenda. What's the pleasure of the board?
Motion to adopt.
Motion by Mr. Fitch, second by Mr. Hunt. Any questions or discussion on the agenda? All those in favor of the agenda as presented, if you raise your hand. Okay. Mr. Humphreys, are you with us by Zoom?
Yes.
Are you in favor of the agenda?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So first we have an operations presentation. McMillan Pasden, I believe you guys are up first. We have Hamilton Court and Mr. Peter Nilsson. Thank you.
Good evening. Yes, we're Hamilton Court and Peter Nilsson with McMillan Pasden Smith Architects. We were hired by the district to do a facility needs assessment. So basically we are assessing the needs of the district by looking at the facilities that you have, the demographics of the county, the spaces that you have, and then providing you options to consider. And we're presenting options for the Shelby zone tonight.
So we'll do kind of a brief presentation, kind of similar to what we did at the last meeting, just a little bit condensed and primarily, actually solely on the Shelby attendance zone. So just as a kind of starter, this assessment that we're doing will be district-wide. So it's not just Shelby or Kings Mountain. It'll also include Crest and the Burns zone for this entire process. So part one of the process is demographics. It's really understanding, what is the projected enrollment, what are the numbers from the area telling us when it comes to whether there's growth or decline in population, which then informs what you do with the enrollment that's going to happen. Not to cover each of these as we kind of did last time, but to cover a few of them. There currently is a deficit in the replacement of the growth that's in the area. So instead of having 2.1 for the growth, to replace it at equal, it's at 1.87. So one of the few things that also tells us is what that means for elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. Over the next 10 years, there's going to be a slight increase in enrollment for your elementary schools, but for middle and high school, there'll be a slight decrease in enrollment. So, it's one way of looking at it. It's just words. We've got, you guys have received this, the demographic report, which has all the data listed out. It's quite a bit of information there, so I hope you've had a chance to take a look at that. But another way of looking at it is in map form. And this map is just kind of showing it for just elementary schools, since we're going to primarily talk about elementary schools this evening. So that's why I just want to show you with this. Again, this same type of information is shown not just for elementary schools, but middle schools and high schools as well for all the attendance zones. So it kind of gives you an idea of where the growth or where the decline is in enrollment projected for the school district. The next part of the process is space utilization. So this is really important tie-in for what the demographic study is telling us. If we understand that there's a significant growth, then we have to look at your facilities appropriately for that, understanding that you would need to have several additions or renovations to handle that growth or change. So all that we're doing with space utilization is actually tying in the data from the demographic study into looking at your current physical spaces. So that way we can understand what is actually currently used for academic space. Was there a different function in those areas? We have to understand what those spaces are and what's actually available within your current schools. That's one of the main things that tie into that, though, is we have to take what the student-to-teacher ratio is as defined by the district. So that's really important. We're not just coming up with utilization numbers that are just based on arbitrary numbers. It's based on spaces available and what the district has mandated as the student-to-teacher ratio, which is very important that you maintain that in the future for whatever you want to do. Another key component to that is really understanding that there's always vacancies that have to happen in a school because there's always a break period or a period that teachers need to work on lessons. So we're not saying 100% capacity of your school has to be used at all time. That's just not realistic. There has to be breaks so that they have time for those lessons. Again, the same process was done for all the schools in the school district. Just currently showing you what is there for the Shelby attendance zone. One of the kind of key factors to look on the far right is when you have anything that's under 200, you're actually in a pretty good spot. If it's kind of that light pink shade that we have there, that means you're above 200 for either a deficiency in space, so you've got over 200 seats that you could possibly use within that, and this is a 10-year projection. And then the darker the shade, the more space you actually have in that facility. And so again, same thing as before, understanding it, there's a whole list of data points that are in those files. Another way to look at it is in map form, so sometimes just an easier way to understand the spaces, and this is kind of a map that shows you what that is for not just elementary schools, but middle schools and high schools throughout the district. So this is what it currently is. And then when you look at 10 years, this also kind of informs us, okay, you can see where some of the growth is and where we should just consider what areas may need additional spaces depending on what that projected enrollment is. So then the third component to our process is the facility assessment. So this is where we go out to each of the schools and go into literally every single space within a school. Whether it's a janitor's closet up on the roofs, any classrooms, this is where we look at all these conditions and really understand what's the physical condition. We're not looking at educational adequacy of the space. It's just the nuts and bolts of a building to make sure that it actually can function for an educational facility. And we go by different zones that we're looking at. Actually, I'll go back one slide here. So the categories we look at are site. What are your access drives for pickup and drop off? Make sure that it's adequate. If there's any fencing that you need or anything like that, looking at what's required for SCDOT. The building envelope and roof. Are your roofs leaking? Are there leaks in your windows? All that components that we're looking at for that. Interiors, whether it's finishes, ceilings, do you have floors that need to be replaced, walls that need to be patched up? That's part of that assessment. Mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems. How are those systems working for you? Are they functional? Are they efficient? Are they near the end of their life? That part we work really closely with the maintenance department because they're in there day in, day out understanding what those requirements are. And then the last component that we look at for each of these schools is health, safety, and security. So this goes from everything from ADA requirements. Do you have security cameras throughout your school? Are there blind spots? Are there code requirements that you should be aware of and understand that this is something that needs to be addressed, or if you do any significant renovation, that's going to trigger us to take these actions within the facility to bring it up to code if necessary. And so as we kind of look at what those ratings are for the Shelby zone, this is how it's broken out. We always break it out by elementary schools, middle schools, high school, and then we included North Shelby in there as well as its own little category since it services kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. If a school is excellent, that's typically, your new constructions usually be like that. I've actually been in, not in Cleveland County, but other school districts, schools that were built within the last 5 years, and they didn't even receive an excellent because there was constructability issues that happened. And so it's always good when you have new facilities that they are 5s. That's great. That means you're not going to have to invest a lot of money into those in the short term. But that being said, we're always typically looking for those 1 to 3s. 1 to 2s are usually the most critical for us to kind of see how those spaces can be used, and those typically have the largest investment required. So far the schools that we've done, these facility assessments are within the Kings Mountain and Shelby zone, but again, same thing as before. All those data points that we have, we want to make sure that we can show that in multiple ways. So when we take all these considerations, we need to have kind of a framework for how we look at this. What we did was we worked in the workshop group with leadership within the district, and we had a bunch of questions that we need to understand so that we can make sure that what we're looking at for the capital improvement plan is concurrent with what they want. And not necessarily what they want, but what the needs are. So we have these questions, and then this kind of helps us look at guiding principles that we need to look at. And primarily, it's making sure that your spaces are efficient and functional. That's first and foremost. I'm not going to go through all these, as you can see right there, but one of the big things we also look at is, do you want to have intermediate schools? Is it required for the district, for your learning requirements, what you want to accomplish? Is it not? So those are questions that we asked, and those became part of the guiding principles as to go with the elementary school, middle school, and high school model. Obviously, that then makes a lot of kind of decisions that have to be made, and that's fine, that's important. But to make those decisions, you have to have all the data behind to really make the right decisions. One of the other important things I just want to point out is what those enrollment numbers that you want to have for your ideal elementary, middle, and high school. It's important to know those so that way if you don't want to have schools that are for like an elementary school that's over 600, we need to know that. So that way we can plan for, you can't have all these schools combined into one, for example. So what does this mean for the Shelby zone? As we look at it, we're looking at how can we take those guiding principles and apply it to the Shelby zone to make sure that it's meeting those criteria. We're looking at these spaces and really being efficient with use of taxpayer dollars within the zone of what the facilities that we have. As we looked at it, to the lower kind of scored schools was Graham and Marion Elementary Schools. And so as we take those principles, looking at how the demographic information is projecting what enrollment numbers are, what your space utilization is, and what the facility condition assessment is, those are the guiding principles for which you start to come up with a game plan for a capital improvement plan within any zone. So for Shelby, the first kind of step to meet those guiding principles is the Shelby Intermediate School to no longer be an intermediate school, to have the 6th graders at that school go to the middle school. That's step one. From that point there, then you can look at, okay, you have Graham and Marion that are kind of the two schools that have the lowest ranking, again, based on facility assessment, utilization, and demographics. Those two schools, then those students would end up going to Shelby, well, it's currently the Shelby Intermediate School. Obviously, that has a big impact. There's more things that are involved, whether or not you have to do some redrawing of lines, or all the bus routes. Those are very important decisions that this then requires to have happened. But that's part of this process. We start, right now we're at that beginning phase of saying, here's the recommendations, and now we need to actually get input from everyone. That's just part of the process. So how does that result? So after the the Marion and Graham elementary schools go into a combined elementary school, and your intermediate sixth graders go to the middle school, this is kind of how that ends up breaking out for facilities that would be online within that next kind of phase of capital improvement planning. There's a couple things that result from this. Obviously, your fifth graders are going to have to go to their appropriate home bases for elementary schools. Another component to that, though, is, what do you do with the pre-K? There's the opportunity they could go to one of your existing facilities, or they could go to their home school, their original home schools that they would have as they currently do. Those are options that you can consider now, think about, and then make decisions at the appropriate time for those. And that is a debrief or a little short presentation on kind of what we're recommending to the school board as an option for the Shelby attendance zone. Now, these options, we've gone through, this is not just the only one we've looked at. We've gone through several iterations of what are ways of making this work so that the guiding principles are met. So this is not the only one that we've looked at, but this is the one that, after all the considerations, makes the most sense of efficient use of buildings and opportunities to make sure that the district is functioning with their spaces as they want to. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Fisher, you have some information?
Can we ask them a question, a couple
Yes.
questions?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes. I've got a couple questions. When y'all were doing this assessment, and maybe you haven't done it on the ones you've done, but maybe we ought to look at this in the future. Did y'all check with our economic development people and our planning and zoning in our counties and towns? Like, for example, Cleveland County's planning and zoning has economic development. City of Shelby's got it. Boiling Springs has a planning and zoning, and Kings Mountain has economic development, planning and zoning. You hear me, Mr. Humphreys? Okay. Well, I want him to hear that because they have it. Did y'all look into those to see what could be the future rising? That they might know that of people coming in that we might not know, but they already know up front. And I'm asking that question, was this took into the factor when y'all come up with these ideas?
So the demographic study takes those into all the data that's available for understanding where the population growths are, because that's where you can understand, are your space utilizations meeting those requirements? So as under those kind of three umbrellas of whether it's space utilization, facility assessment, or demographic study, that one falls more in the demographic study, and that's part of their process to see what any of the available documents are for developments, and if anything's permitted for construction, that's where they can get that information from. And so what was available is what has been in that final report that you've received for.
That the county had, or that we had, or who had? Did y'all go to those places and look into that, or did we supply that?
So the demographic study does go into the county records. They look at the parcels that are undeveloped, and they look at things that are used by right that haven't been developed. They look at permits that are in place, but they don't take into consideration speculative developments that haven't been subdivided for development. So if there's a large 200 tract land that people may at a future point in the future, want to subdivide into housing that people are talking about but haven't done yet, that's not something that the demographic report, that's kind of where the demographic report draws its line, is on things that are actual and not anything that is sort of planned but not in the works yet.
Okay, I have one more question. All right. On other did you look at other districts that had intermediate schools, and on the progress, was that better to have the intermediates or not?
So on the subject of intermediate schools, so a lot of districts go and do intermediate schools, and some of them do it for a lot of different reasons. And the benefits of doing intermediate schools versus the benefits of doing middle schools are kind of all over the place. And you can make the argument in a lot of instances that intermediate school might be better in some instances. You can make an argument that the middle school might be better in some instances. So what we did is we kind of said, if you take all these factors and you look at middle schools, intermediate schools, and kind of figure that they're all going to kind of offset each other, it's hard to really make the argument. There's no conclusive data that says this is the way to go, that this isn't the way to go. So what we did is we looked at the district and what they're doing. We also looked at the trends in the state and what they're doing. And so really the infrastructure across the state is kind of built around the middle school model. So the peer-to-peer network for middle school teachers is in place in North Carolina. You have a split district where you've got where you have middle schools. So you have middle schools here in your traditional 6 to 8 model that are kind of in line with the state model. And then you've got intermediate schools as well. So in our recommendations on which direction you ought to go, it kind of tilted toward going to the middle school model. And again, everybody does it for different ways, but specific to Cleveland County Schools, that's kind of where we hinged our recommendations.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Glover?
I have one question. On the last slide, make sure that I understand what this slide has on here. Your projection for 2031, 2032, if I'm looking at those numbers right, in 10 years, will James Love and Jefferson both be over capacity?
Yes. And what that comes from is the fifth graders that are diverging from the Shelby Intermediate School. That's a big driver to get past that point. Now, the target capacity is obviously what you want to aim for. That gives you a little bit of flexibility in case there's growth or decline, that you're not having lots of classrooms empty versus completely packed. So if the enrollment numbers exceed that, then you have to start looking, planning now is, all right, do we need to look at doing a small renovation, or do we have to do an addition, or do we just keep what we have? And so based on what the target capacities for those schools, that yes, you would end up needing to do small addition to those schools if this recommendation is the direction that the school board would like to go.
So with your recommendation of closing 2 schools, but you're projecting in 10 years, we're going to be, 2 of those schools are going to be too crowded, basically. So
If I can interject, as I understand it, the 5th graders were equally divided
Yes.
across the 3 schools, Graham and Marion, which would be the old Shelby Intermediate, and then James Love and Jefferson. So there's some excess capacity there at the old Shelby Intermediate to accommodate those others.
And that's part of the redrawing that you would probably have to do to make sure that you're meeting your target capacities, not exceeding them.
But I hope you just understand what I'm saying. Just
Yes.
kind of making sure I understand that, looking at the numbers here, wanting to close 2 schools, but in 10 years, we're going to be in a mess unless we do some switching around. So, all right, thank you.
Any other questions?
So that overcapacity would be only if we do not redraw lines. If we leave the districts like they are, is that what we're saying? They would be over capacity if we don't redraw lines?
Well, I don't believe those numbers were based on any particular lines. It's just there's X number of 5th graders, divided that by 3, and put those in those 3 schools. So if we shift some 5th graders, or it may get shifted all the way down through all 5 grades.
Yep.
But when you add up the totals, there's still capacity
Yeah,
there.
so the note that's just under the map, so it's 213 fifth graders that we said, okay, if we're playing out, if you had equal distribution. Obviously, that's not going to be the case. But just for us to understand what this means for each of the schools, that's the way that we approach is that equal distribution. And we understand that that's probably not going to be the case just because you have to look at the facilities that you have and the available spaces for that and adjust accordingly to that.
Any other questions?
But I just done the math on it. You're looking at 6 children, 6 students at Jefferson and 57 at James Love. So basically, if you just shifted just a little bit on those lines, because they're crossing lines to go to the old intermediate school.
Yep.
They're crossing there anyway. So if they went to actually the zone they went to, then that would pull that down. Is that the way you said that? Did I understand that correct?
No, what we're saying is if you do the combined elementary schools, you're going to have in 10 years, 213 is what the projected number would be of fifth graders. That would be, for this exercise, it's saying if you equally distributed those to Jefferson, the combined elementary school, and James Love, that's how you get the 213 equally distributed. And if that ends up being, as you said, 6 for
6 for Jefferson and 57 for James Love.
Yep. And so, that's part of the exercise. And if you if you redraw the lines as you need to make sure that you're meeting those target capacities, then it's a success for what you want to do enrollment in those schools.
Anyone else? All right, thank you. Go ahead.
So are you saying based on how we draw, if we pass this, based on how we redraw the lines, will have a big impact on these numbers 10 years from now? Basically, this isn't written in stone.
So
you're basing this on dividing it by 3.
with having 3 elementary schools within the Shelby attendance zone.
Right.
Yep.
But this could vary based on how the drawings, the lines
Correct.
are drawn.
Yeah, and part of the process is, within that demographic studies, we have a very accurate location of where those projected students are going to be coming from. So we have really good data that we can pull from to make sure that the redrawing, if it has to happen, can be very targeted and it's not completely blown out of the way it shouldn't be. It's very targeted for what you need to have, so you can make those really smart and decisive decisions on what has to be redrawn.
I think a good way of kind of conceptualizing it is, if you look at the total seats, the open seats that you've got in the district now, it basically equals a whole elementary school. It's just scattered across a bunch of schools. And so when you look at the total number of seats in 2030, 2032, the total number of open seats that you'll have after you consolidate those, you're still going to have excess capacity. It's just how you proportion them out. So you've got a whole school's worth now. If you were to consolidate, you'll still have some excess capacity, and you'll have control over how you can kind of proportion those out based on your lines.
Okay. I think that was a little bit confusing to how that was presented. Okay, thank you.
And just for information, Mr. Pless will have some sample maps he's going to present later.
Just a quick question, and you might or might not have this answer. If we did not even touch the line, for example, Jefferson Elementary School, would we be overcrowded in 10 years? With no redrawing of their lines, leaving everybody where they're at right now, would we be overcrowded at Jefferson in 10 years?
We'd have to look at the breakdown that we have in that space utilization chart, because that has the exact numbers for each school as to where, if you had, because in this chart right here, it doesn't say you've got 80 fifth graders that would be have to move. So I don't have a definitive answer for you on that, because we have the information available. We just have to go look at the file and to see where that actually goes without having to do any redrawing. So
I didn't mean to throw something
No.
at you, just.
Nope,
All right.
and that's the thing, is having all that data available to make those decisions allows you to do that, because it's a very valid question to have, is, if we don't have to redraw lines, is this possible? Well, we have that information that we can not do the equal distribution of fifth graders, perhaps. So.
Yeah,
that
because
is-
if you redraw lines, you're not just messing with that, you're messing with a lot more schools than you are just shutting down two and moving
Correct.
to one building. So it affects a lot more families.
Yes.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Dr. Fisher?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. I told these guys to stay close just in case you ask any hard questions, so I could defer to the experts. Appreciate the opportunity to come and talk a little bit tonight about some follow-up information from McMillan Pasden Smith's recommendations and their work, and really appreciate what they're doing in our district and the extensive work they're doing on facilities assessment. So tonight, just kind of a little bit of an overview of kind of some things we want to talk about. I do want to give you some information update that may help kind of put some facts behind some of the information they have, to kind of talk through some of that with this information update tonight. One of the things I want to kind of, I'm going to get a little bit ahead of myself in some questions, just to kind of follow up on the conversation that they were having in terms of the target capacity that's listed on there. It is just that, a target capacity. The target capacity is really identified in a perfect scenario. For example, and I'm just going to use this example, and I'm going to do this a couple times tonight. I want to be careful to say to everybody that's listening here and online that I'm just giving some examples with this, but a target capacity would include like art and music having each their own separate area. Some of those things being able to spread out. So that's under an ideal situation. And so sometimes you may not, the target capacity and the real capacity really would be two different numbers. So when you think about the long term where we are in a couple of years, those things can be, from a scheduling standpoint, can be worked through. The other piece of that is this was not asked as a question. I'll get to the question, is really about our transfer process. It's not our intention to edit or change the student transfer process that we have right now. It's been a process that we've worked over really the last almost 15 years, and it's worked well. But we do have a lot of students that transfer from school to school, and we base all those transfers on class size and capacity. And so we would need to continue to look at that as we work through that. So when you look about available seats in our schools, the transfer process is something to continue to keep in mind. So that was not asked as a question, and I'll get to those questions in just a minute, but wanted to make sure we have that as another piece of the pie here. Peter did mention the governing principles that were discussed. I feel like that really kind of frames some of the things, especially, and we'll get to some of those as we get through some of these questions. Just to restate, the recommendation from the proposal is to move to 3 elementary schools in the Shelby attendance zone, which are Jefferson Elementary, James Love Elementary, and then a new Shelby Elementary. And for the conversation tonight, that's what we're going to refer to that as the new Shelby Elementary School. That new Shelby Elementary School in the proposal would be housed at the current Shelby Intermediate or the building there on South Post Road. And then the Shelby Middle School and Shelby High School. And this does then obviously include closing 2 schools in the Shelby attendance zone, which is Marion Elementary and Graham Elementary. I've had the opportunity over the last really 2 weeks to meet with the staffs of really the 3 schools most impacted, Graham, Marion, and Shelby Intermediate. That visit schedule was interrupted by, I think it was Winter Storm Izzy. So took a week break from meeting with those staffs, but had really great meetings at all 3 of those campuses. Probably spent almost an hour and a half at each site, answering questions, talking with the staff, working through that. I've had some follow-up conversations with staff members, so that was very beneficial for me, and I hope it was for our staff. Obviously, as a part of this, we're having a public hearing tonight, and to be able to get information to you, as well as making that information public, and as well as having the opportunity to hear from the public. We do have an online question portal. You can go to our website. On one of the banners that comes by, there's a place to put questions. You don't have to put your name. You don't have to put any identifying information. You just type in the question, and we've got that. And so in just a few minutes, we're going to go through multiple slides to really highlight those questions. We've had about 70 questions that have been submitted. I've taken the liberty of trying to combine like questions. We had a lot of questions about how we'll deal with staff, a lot of questions about have we considered, this or that. And so I tried to combine those opportunities to make sure that we were able to get through that information. We'll continue to have that online question portal available. And it gets to a next bullet point. After tonight's presentation, either later tonight or tomorrow, this presentation will be online so folks can see the question and answer, and then we'll continue to update a FAQ from questions that we continue to get in. So just to kind of go through this, and I'll try to go through these fairly quickly to keep this moving along, but wanted to provide this information, looking at how to present all this information. Really, we decided that the best way is just to really go through kind of a question and answer that was submitted. So, these are in pretty much order they were submitted. We did try to combine some things. So you may say, well, gosh, he's jumped around a little bit from subject areas. And yes, we're doing that, but really wanted to keep the integrity of what was going on. So will there be mobile classrooms added due to the reorganization? And the answer to that is mobile classrooms are not included in the plans for reorganization. Was Shelby Middle School built to accommodate 6th graders in addition to 7th and 8th graders? And that answer is yes. Shelby Middle School has a core capacity of approximately 800. And there's plenty of instructional space at Shelby Middle School to accommodate the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students in attendance, Shelby attendance zone. Currently have about approximately 450 students plus or minus in that school, so there's obviously plenty of instructional space there at Shelby Middle to accommodate the 6th, 7th, and 8th. What does this do to class size? And any reorganization would not change class size restrictions. Actually, this question was asked a good little bit, and it's a great question. Class size regulations for K-3 are set by the General Assembly. The kindergarten max is 21. It doesn't matter if we have 2,000 kids in our elementary school or 12 kids. Class size in kindergarten, the max is 21. The max in first grade is 19, and the max in second and third grade is 20. So those class size restrictions stay into effect regardless of how big or small those elementary schools are. The recommendations for 4th through 8th are set by DPI and Cleveland County Schools, and we follow that. So from a class size perspective, and I can understand from a parent, what does this do to my child's class size? It's really not going to impact that. It does allow us, and you can see that in the guiding principles. One of the things that you continue to see, you'll see in the answers in red, and you continue to hear people say, is effectiveness and efficiency. We want to be able to use our dollars as effective and efficient as we can. And to be able to do this, we feel like that's where those guiding principles really are driving us. Will there be a preschool, NC Pre-K, Head Start classrooms? Where will they be located? And the proposal includes a Shelby Zone Preschool Center. And the location at this point, according to the recommendation, would be at the Shelby Elementary School. We would locate all of those preschool classrooms there, have a preschool center at that school, and so you would not have preschool at Jefferson or at James Love, all your preschool there. That does work with busing. We've worked with Mr. Plesser, Transportation Director. We have a plan, if that's approved, to move forward with that. There's a lot of advantages by locating those at one site to be able to use those resources and have more resources at one site for those pre-Ks. Was school choice other than enrollment in CCS considered in the proposal? And really these recommendations are based on our facilities and where our students attend. Obviously we're in the time in the world of school choice. We have students that attend private school, charter school, homeschool, and they have those opportunities for school choice. But really from this recommendation was the students that we have in our facilities with that. Were renovations at Marion considered to add students at that facility? And yes, potential renovations were considered at all of our facilities. And this current recommendation really stems from the most effective utilization of current facilities and anticipated cost of future innovations. And for example, I'll use Marion as an example. You guys understand and know that building has multiple floors. And all the first floors don't line up and all the second floors don't line up. So you can go upstairs and downstairs and walk around. And obviously students or staff that have movement issues, brings a concern. Going up steps, down steps. We have one elevator, but the recommendations that came from the facility assessment were to add, 2 elevators. And as we look at those facilities to be able to say what's the most efficient and effective use of those facilities. What costs will be there to be the remaining buildings, and will these costs offset and savings made through the reorganization? It's important to understand that continued upkeep and sustained operational and maintenance costs are considered and will be addressed in the facility assessment and long-term capital plan. However, these costs would not exceed efficiency savings. And I think that the gist of that question would be, are what you're saving going to outweigh any improvements that you'll make to the new facilities? And in our opinion, that is no, because you're going to update and continue to update those facilities, whether you have 29 schools or whether we have 27 schools as a district, and whether in the Shelby zone, whether we have 7 schools or 5 schools, you're going to still need to update the facilities that you have by addressing some of these potential reorganization plans. We're actually able to eliminate some of the long-term and sustainability costs that we have. What is the timeline? And obviously, had a couple questions on that, and the timeline depends on board approval. Not to put pressure on you guys, but it does depend on when this is approved. And as we stated here, it could be for the 22-23 school year, but that's a consideration that the board would make. Will a transition team be created for internal transition? And I think this was a wonderful question. We've had some dialogue with some of our team members already. And yes, the CCS transition team will be created to assist with the planning and implementation of any approved plan. And as I've met with staff members, I've tried to emphasize that we're in the planning process now. With the public hearing, with getting input, with answering questions and having conversation. But we will begin to put together a transition team that if and when this is approved, that transition team can help with the full transition. And what does that mean? It looks like, how are we going to move staff members? Who's going to do this? What's going to happen? What's the timeline of all this to really getting good input from our stakeholders? Another great question that's come up several times, and I would say this is probably outside of staffing, it was really the second most asked question, is what's the plan for the school buildings and facilities, which would be Graham and Mary with this proposal. And upon approval of any plan, Cleveland County Schools plans to engage community leaders and stakeholders in an exhaustive process to determine best uses for those facilities. We understand that vacant school buildings aren't the best for anybody. It's not best for us to own those. It's not best for the community to let those facilities stay vacant. So upon any approval of this plan, we will begin to work with community leaders, stakeholders, to be able to determine what's the best use of those and how that moves forward. That will be a part of the transition team, and we probably have some external and some internal parts of that transition team to be able to look at what are those uses for those potential schools. Will stakeholder input and planning be allowed for these buildings? And definitely so, yes. Stakeholder input and planning is an important factor in the process. We feel like we've already began that with meeting with our schools, getting input, talking with staff members. We've had some wonderful ideas. Just yesterday when I met with the Shelby Intermediate staff, stayed after a few minutes and met with several teachers, and they had just some really good ideas. If it was approved, then looking forward to how we implement this and timetables and when we do different things. So it is important to get that input for planning and implementation standpoint. Will a plan be created that is available to all staff and the public? Yes. And again, this document will be available tomorrow on our website, on board docs. We'll continue to put the FAQ questions out with answers to be able to make sure that information is readily available. So was it considered to only combine elementary schools and leave the intermediate school as is? And as Peter and Hamilton said, all avenues really have been and are being considered. The goal is, again, and I'm going to highlight that, effectively and efficiently use our resources. But the utilization of Shelby Middle was important. There was some discussion about just combining the elementary schools and leaving the intermediate school as is. But really, that doesn't factor in the utilization of that Shelby Middle School. As you've seen in the report tonight, and if you saw the report at the last board meeting, Shelby Middle School was rated 5. That's a new school. We want to maximize the use of that facility. As you guys know, you've been in that school. It's a beautiful facility, meets the needs of our student learners. Why were these facilities considered, and was selling the Shelby Intermediate School considered? And we did. Recommendations were made on the size, utilization, and overall operational capacity of the buildings. We looked at buildings that were rated a 2, and how does that work? How does that factor in there? Look at the size of the schools. Look at where those schools are located and the functionality of those schools. Thinking about pre-K. I know I talked about pre-K just a minute ago, but where do we have outside doors? Where can we put Head Start classrooms? All of those things really are factored in to that equation and the recommendation. This was an interesting question. If people or groups are interested in purchasing Graham or Marion facilities, how do they make that interest known? They can make that interest to me or to Dr. Greg Shull. We're not at that point yet, but as we begin to move, if we do have people that are interested, they can communicate that to us. Why move from the intermediate 5-6 concept to a K-5 elementary and a middle 6-8? And Peter talked about that a little bit. Across the state, middle school 6-8 is the most popular middle school, avenue. It's used most often, and across the state, the majority of schools are K-5, 6-8, 9-12. There are exceptions to that. We have some of the exceptions here in Cleveland County, but there are different exceptions to that. When you look at that, I think from an instructional standpoint, there's not a documented and noticeable difference in what we see from student performance, whether it's and we have able to really do good action research here in Cleveland County, from having 2 6-8 middle schools to having 2 5-6 intermediates and 7-8 middle schools. So there's not a significant difference in terms of student performance. In terms of best case scenarios, I refer back to the implementation, how things are done at that school. There are strategies that you can put in place to really integrate 6th graders into a middle school. In the last several years, we've seen athletics include 6th graders where they haven't before. And so it does create an issue in Shelby because the schools aren't beside each other, just from an athletic standpoint, getting your 6th graders over to Shelby Middle School for athletics. There is some advantage of keeping those 5th graders at the elementary a little bit longer. We see some of that. One of the downsides about intermediate schools having K4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12 is 4 different schools, which includes 3 transitions. We know transitions are difficult, and that transition year typically is a challenging year. So one of the advantages to moving to a K-5, 6-8 concept is you limit those transitions. I think there's lots of research on both sides of that. Is 6th grade better at an elementary or intermediate setting? Is 6th grade better at a middle school? And if you can do, a 5-minute research, Google search, and you'll find data that supports on both sides. I believe it's about the implementation and how you do those things. And we've got schools that do that very well. Look at the data that's come, especially over the last several years from Crest Middle and Burns Middle. You see 2 very successful implementations where 6th graders do well at those schools. So I've talked a little bit, never got around to the answer that's on here, but the goal is to maximize our facilities and to be as effective and efficient as operations possible. And in that zone, the K-5, the 6-8, and 9-12 structure is widely used in North Carolina and has been implemented successfully in Cleveland County. And again, we get back to be able to utilize the facilities that are the best in our county. What is the impact on school transportation? And there will be an impact on transportation, but due to the proximity of schools, the impact will be minimal. And in some cases, the impact may be positive due to improved efficiency because we're able to move students more efficiently. In some areas maybe where we are using 3 buses, but they don't fill 3 buses up, and really don't need 3 buses because of the number of students, because of the directions they're going. We use 3 buses. Now we may be able to be more efficient with that. So there's really not a significant impact on school transportation, and definitely not a significant negative impact on school transportation. One question that came up that didn't get on the list, but did come up in several of our school visits was about preschool transportation. Because right now we have preschools at our elementary schools, and preschoolers ride our buses. And so if we have a preschool center, would all of the preschools in the Shelby zone, would they be able to ride those buses? And the answer to that is yes. And just an example, we may have a preschooler that lives in the James Love district, so we pick all our James Love students up, including that James Love preschoolers. Bus stops at James Love, lets off the K-5 students, drives to the Shelby Elementary, drops off a pre-K student, and that bus returns to wherever that bus driver works. So that is something that's very feasible and doesn't create very much of an issue. The staff, again, I mentioned when I talked about questions, I think staffing was probably the biggest question area, both in terms of face-to-face meetings and with the questions online. And will there be staff that lose their jobs due to reorganization? And that answer is no. Staff members will not lose their job because of reorganization. And I want to say that again and emphasize that. Staff members will not lose their job because of reorganization. Furthermore, no staff member will lose salary or benefits. And to quote what I've said in our staff meetings, folks that are 11-month employees are going to be 11-month employees. Folks that are 12-month employees are going to be 12-month employees. If you're a teacher, you're going to be a teacher. Folks are not going to lose their jobs with that. Now, we can't guarantee that if you're teaching third grade in the corner classroom, that you're going to continue to teach third grade in the corner classroom. I can't guarantee that from a year-to-year basis anyway. But people aren't going to lose their jobs. We're going to work through that administrative process. We have vacancies in our schools from from teachers to classified positions. The staff part of that will work out. And I'll mention that in just a minute to get through some of these other staffing ones. Who will be the principal, assistant principal at the new school or schools? And that decision has not been made at this time. If the proposed plan is approved and the timeline includes an implementation for the 22-23 school year, administrative assignments will be an important factor that will be done fairly early in the process. And so we got that question come up a couple times. Will teachers have a choice in what they teach if their school is a part of the restructure? And again, that's a little bit of an interesting question because they have a choice of what they teach. Well, again, those are decisions made by that principal, whether, this year we're teaching block or we're teaching self-contained classrooms in the elementary school. Are we at the middle school, are we a two-man team or are we a three-man team? Those things are changed. So we have to be careful to answer that correctly. But a comprehensive human resources plan will be implemented to put all staff members in the best possible scenario. Multiple factors will be used in the placement of staff, including but not limited to staff preference, licensure, areas of strength, school needs. All those things will be factored in. If you're a K-5 licensed or K-6 licensed teacher, then you want to be in elementary school, it's a lot easier to do that. But if you're a middle school licensed teacher, which is 6-8, you're probably going to be at the middle school. You may teach at Shelby Intermediate now, but licensure does impact those operations. So if this is approved, we do have some templates that we can use, a process that we feel good about to work through the human resources process and work with our staff members. We want to make sure that we create win-win situations for everybody. We want, wins for our students, we want wins for our staff, and we want wins for our community. And it's important that we work hard to make sure we try to provide those win-win opportunities for everybody. Will everybody get their first choice? Probably not. But we believe that the vast majority of staff members will be able to get that first choice of a school assignment or school location. Again, you may prefer to teach second grade, but be asked by the principal that they need you to teach kindergarten. But those things happen on a yearly basis anyway, and that would really be outside of administrative or board control. What will happen to specialized employee positions? And this is, again, an excellent staffing question because it does go to reason that, if you've got 3 schools and you have 3 data managers, and you just using data managers as an example, what happens with those processes? And again, I want to go back to the slide before. Nobody's going to lose their job. Nobody's going to lose salary. Nobody's going to lose benefits, all those type of things. And we'll work through that process. Just because you were doing, one thing one year, your job may change a little bit. We have a pre-K center. We have different things that we can work through to make sure we keep our staff members employed in doing that. I used the biblical example in at least 2, if not 3 of the staff of the meetings, and the idea that the fields are white with harvest, and we have kids that we have lots of opportunities to meet those needs, and the workers will have plenty of stuff to do and to work through. So, I understand that is definitely a concern, but we can be creative with some of the placements and things we're doing to make sure we're meeting the needs of students. We want to be real intentional about creating an environment. If this is approved, we want to be real intentional about creating a wonderful environment for Shelby Elementary School. And so we put resources in there. We want to be real intentional about making sure we have great transitions for our 6th graders to move to the middle school. So you put resources in there. So from a staff perspective, I know people, that is a concern, but, and I think we got some staff members here, and the first thing I told those staff members is, don't panic. Don't panic. And there's times where looking at all the things to do, we've looked in there and said, and I had to tell myself, don't panic. but really that we'll work through that process. How will staffing be determined? Staff preference, seniority, and really multiple factors will be used in the placement of staff, including but not limited to staff preference, licensure, area strength, school needs. I've mentioned that. Extra resources will be allocated to Jefferson, James Love, and New Shelby Elementary to help with additional classroom spaces. And the district will ensure that all schools have the resources needed to meet the educational needs of students and staff. We want to make sure we create wonderful environments that every parent wants to send their child to those schools. We talk about cultivating excellence, and we'll use the resources we have to cultivate excellence in those 3 schools. Will the entire Shelby zone be redistricted? And that's, again, be careful how I answer that, because I don't want to give an answer and mislead, but the draft proposal includes 3 elementary attendance zones inside the Shelby zone. The Jefferson and James Love zones will change slightly, and Mr. Pless will get into that. I want to go ahead and emphasize, and I'm going to say this a couple times, I say things to repeat myself because I want to make sure that if you miss it the first or second time, you'll get it the third time. These are draft proposals. So I don't want people taking that and it's like, oh, well, this is what it said, this is what's going on. These are draft proposals from an attendance standpoint that probably will be tweaked a little bit, but David, Mr. Pless and his team have spent a lot of time on that, so looking at that. So there is some redistricting going on there, but it's not significant in the James Love and Jefferson zones. It's a little more in the James Love than in the Jefferson zone, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes. Will redistricting outside the Shelby zone be considered to move students from other zones into the Shelby zone? And what I believe this question meant was from other high school attendance zones, like from the Crest zone to Shelby, from the Burns, or from Kings Mountain to Shelby. And not at this time. The high school attendance zones were not impacted by this recommendation. If you go back to the guiding principles, we wanted to stay true to our attendance feeder zones. How does this impact student funding, and how does this impact Title I funding? The impact will allow for a more efficient use of funding and resources, including Title I funding. And Title I funding is driven by student population and demographics. So from a Title I, if you got 300 students and now you move to 400 students, depending on the demographic of those students, you're going to get more Title I funding. The larger schools, there's more funding. So it's really a funding follows the child mentality. That will be correlated with student enrollment. Will the new elementary school have a traditional year-round calendar, and would it include school uniforms? And the recommendation would be for the new elementary school to implement a traditional calendar and no conversation about school uniforms at this time. I think that if the proposal was moved forward, we would follow our normal procedures. If a school had a plan, they would work through their school improvement team. They would work for their school. And at some point, if a school, any school in the district wanted to make a recommendation to the board, they could work through that. And there's a process to do that. But we would, the default would move to a traditional calendar with no school uniforms. I know we did have one of the elementary schools that did some uniform work and a traditional calendar. This is for the elementary schools. This would not impact any uniform decisions that are already at Shelby Middle School. But they would have the opportunity to keep their school uniforms at Shelby Middle School. These are talking about the elementary schools that would be impacted. Will new home construction in Shelby, and this is, I think, what Mr. Blanton got to a little bit, create spacing issues and overcrowding in the future? A demographic study was done, part of the facilities assessment. While there is some projected growth in the Shelby zone, the utilization of schools under this proposed plan accommodates for that projected growth. We get into some of that as far as being able to handle that from an ideal capacity to a real capacity. And are you closing the Shelby intermediate building? And this was a comment, or really a question that came in today, mostly 2 or 3 of those. And no, that proposal does not include closing that facility there on Post Road. What it does say is we're going to move Shelby Intermediate to Shelby Elementary. I think there may have been some confusion when people were saying we're going to close Shelby Intermediate, that they thought we were getting rid of that building. And people were asking, had a question about, was that going to be sold to the county? Was that going to be sold to the college? Was that going to be done whatever? No, that building, that school building on Post Road, we'll keep that. That will become Shelby Elementary. I have got some questions about what would we name that? And that's a decision that after an approval and a recommendation may be at later. So there's not a recommendation to close the school building on Post Road. So I told Mr. Shores I had 58 slides. He pulled his chain a little bit and didn't, so I know he's timing me. But I'm going to ask Mr. Pless to come and give you some information about the Shelby Elementary boundaries. I've emphasized, I went in and edited his slide a little bit, and I'll take credit or blame for every time you see red draft, that's me. Because I want to emphasize to you and everybody here and everybody watching to look at this. These are drafts. These are subject to change, subject to input. But Mr. Pless has done a good job of coordinating that. And again, if I didn't say it already, these are drafts and not to be set in stone at this time. So, Mr. Pless?
Thank you, Dr. Fisher, board members, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity. As always, controversial when you're talking about redrawing lines. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about that. This is a map of the current Shelby elementary boundaries. You can see for reference the dark blue line that goes through the middle of the map there. That's Highway 74. The pink at the top is the current Jefferson zone. The green is currently the Marion zone. Yellow is James Love, and the blue is Graham. I want to point out 74 again to show you that the Graham zone currently goes across 74, and the yellow in the James Love currently goes on the other side of 74. So, as Dr. Fisher said, the draft of what we have come up with, and I say we, the transportation team, especially Leslie Davis, our TIMS manager, I'd like to thank her publicly for all the hard work that she's done on this. The yellow zone now, the James Love zone, would stay completely on the south side of 74. I'm excited about the possibility of taking less buses off of Highway 74. We'll still have some, but the less we can have on crossing over 74, the better. Currently, let me go back to our current zones. If you see the green crossing over 74, that would be Wesson Road headed towards the Crest zone is currently Graham. That would, in the new draft, would be James Love. If you look at back to old Shelby, the current boundaries that we have, the yellow in James Love going across 74, that would be the area. A good reference would be Bethel Church on DeKalb Street. That area is currently James Love. So in the new boundaries, that area would be part of the Marion zone, or excuse me, part of the new Shelby elementary zone. If you see the pink, that's the Jefferson zone. If you are currently in the Jefferson zone, you would remain in the Jefferson zone, and the Jefferson zone would expand to include, point of reference, where we are right now, Shelby City Park area, Westover Terrace, that area. So when I look at this map and thinking about like the new Shelby Elementary zone, looks like for a city school that looks large geographically compared to what we're used to. But when I look at a map of, say, Washington Elementary School or Springmore Elementary School, what it covers geographically, that's relatively small compared to those. So that's the idea that we have. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you guys have about the proposed new Shelby Elementary boundaries.
Any questions for Mr. Pless? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, I would just like to say, appreciate the work of our entire team. You've got a couple more slides in there where it's just highlighted just the Jefferson, just the Shelby Elementary, and just the James Love component, but it really shows best you put all three together and look at that. So this time, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, we'll try to answer any questions that you may have, or
Any questions for Dr. Fisher? All right. Mr. Glover?
I have a question. The timeline, just a little concerning. You know, as I've heard from a lot of our staff and our teachers, this school year has probably been more difficult than any year that we've ever had, even the one that we went to remote the year before. And if we approve this, you know, we're putting a lot more on those teachers that are going to be affected by this move. In closing, saying that timeline, I mean, if the board approved, it could be in February or March. Is there enough time to do everything the correct way without, I don't want to say without putting more on the teachers, because it's going to put a lot on the teachers. But can we do it the correct way, in the fair way for everybody that quick by next school year? I've moved a teacher before from a school to another school, from one classroom to another classroom. It is not pleasant. It's not a fun time. But it's challenging. So that, you know, that's concerning because of the timeline. And, you know, we're going to ask a lot of these teachers, they're going to have to do a whole lot of work during the summertime, and they deserve that time off. Just a little bit about your thoughts on the timeline and the challenges that they're going to have on that.
Well, I think it's a great point in conversations that we've had with staff members. And I feel like if this board made a decision to move forward with a recommendation or to move in this direction, then as we get into March, it does become an issue. Not only, and we've had this discussion both with teachers and schools, but also with our staff in terms of human resources, maintenance, facilities, all those involved, because we've done some things in over the last really 10 to 15 years, whether it's building Shelby Middle School, building North Shelby. That is a collective effort that takes a lot of time, energy, and effort. To directly answer your question, I think that February gives us adequate time. Again, there's a lot to do, and we don't have time to waste with that. There will be definitely a sense of urgency if the board wants to move in that direction in February. I do begin to have, more concern and heightened alertness and awareness if this gets into March, just because of the time and turnaround it takes to get staff placed appropriately and to implement those things, because there's a lot has to be done on the front end. There is the physical move, and that's one component of the physical move, but there's also a lot of background work that has to be done in terms of, where the principal's at, who's teaching, where those assignments are going, and the organization of schools, as you know, have seen that done in the past. So the timeline is tight even in February. I believe that can be done, but I also believe that this board needs to be comfortable in the decision that they make and the timeline that they put forth. And again, being very honest and blunt, that the March timeline from just to be able to get stuff done begins to creep in there, because if it's approved in February, there definitely will be a sense of urgency that needs to go, that we need to move forward with to be able to make things work and it not feel rushed and being able to feel like it's not in panic mode.
Just a follow-up to that. Is there a rush that we get this done by next school year? I mean, is that like something that we have somewhere that, man, we've done this assessment, we got the recommendations, now we got to rock and roll and do it?
We're not on the time clock.
We're not on the time.
There's not a shot clock. So, I mean, we're really, at this point, from a facility assessment, McMillan, Patterson, Smith, they've done their work. They've done that work in the Shelby zone. They continue to do in the other zone. They've made some recommendations. But at this point, there's not if you don't do it by here, you'll never do it. It's just a matter of when do you want to move forward with that, and when is that the ideal time to take that next step?
All right, thank you. I have another question, but I'll open it to other people and I'll follow up later.
Okay. Any other questions for Dr. Fisher? Looks like the floor's still yours.
And I apologize,
Oh,
but
you're
I
good.
just,
That's all right.
I've been through this process before when we've changed one school to another school, and it's not pleasant. Lost a lot of friends on that in the past. But I thought we did the right thing. At the time, 11, 12 years ago, the talk was intermediate schools are the way to go. That was the talk. And now we're kind of shifting that away. Not to bring up another zone, but if we're saying it's not good enough for this zone, are we going to say the same thing for the other zone? I think there's advantages for our intermediate schools. I think they do a really good job. So I do have a question on that. One question for you gentlemen, if you can answer this. Looking at the Shelby Intermediate School, which you're calling it the new Shelby School. Years ago, you can tell I've been on for a little bit, which is probably good and bad, but the building, the old building closest to Post Road, are you familiar with which one I'm talking about? I don't know if there's a particular name, but it's the oldest.
The old section there.
The old section there. Did that section make that whole school lower to a 3? Would that school been like rated as a 4 if that building wasn't included? And the reason I say that, there was conversation 13, 14 years ago that we needed to replace that building. So it's just a concern that there's been conversations for a long time about that section of the building, and then we're still feel like it's okay to put students in there. So
Yep.
just,
So the way that we look at each facility is it's a weighted scale for the entire facility. Obviously, when there's one part of a building that clearly has issues with it, the way that we look at that is that space currently used? Because there are some schools that I've been in the past where they don't use that facility anymore. They don't use it all their academics are in this part. And so we look at that when we come up with the scoring of that facility. So if it's used currently as it's intended, then we take that into consideration as part of the entire scoring of the entire facility.
okay.
And another aspect of that also is when we look at what makes the biggest impact on these scores as well as cost. Because if you're looking to just replace flooring in a school, for example, that's a significantly different cost versus replacing an HVAC system. And so that is part of that weighted grading that we do for each facility. And the same thing would apply for the current Shelby Intermediate School.
In your assessment, and I don't know if you did the assessment on that, or that would be under Dr. Fisher, what would be housed in that older part of that building?
I do not have that answer.
Or would that still be in the planning stage?
Yeah, yes, Mr. Glover. I think that what would be housed in those, like in that part of that school, really would be, I think, the work of the implementation team as you work with the new administrative team, where you place classrooms. The one thing we have done is gone in and looked at classrooms that are eligible to be licensed for Head Start, especially, because that is a different animal than putting a first or second grade. For example, do they have two points of egress? Do they have a door into the hall and then an exterior door? That those things are needed. So that part has been able to be done to look at from the Shelby Elementary perspective. But in terms of, we put the first grade here, the kindergarten here, that's not been that extensive at that time.
Thank you.
And I think to go, just to go back and circle back to the question about the intermediate schools, I think it's important that, I don't think it's an idea that one system is really better or worse than the other. I think that, again, you can find research that would support saying that sixth grade's better at an elementary school. You would find research that would support sixth grades are better at middle schools. You would find research that ninth grade is better at middle school, and you ought to go back to the old junior high model of 7, 8, 9. I think that, when we look at our data and look at, you can look at research and you look at Cleveland County school data. What are our schools performing? What's the last 10 years of school performance growth show us? What's the last 5 or 6 years of met and exceeded growth show us in terms of what's happening? I think that we've shown from an internal perspective, from an instructional perspective, that we can provide those exceptional opportunities in a middle school format. We can also provide them into an intermediate school format. I don't believe it's the play as much as it is the execution of that. And so when you have great teachers, great administrators running those plays and executing that game plan, that works whether you're at a 5-6 or 6-8, that can be implemented. So I think from the facilities assessment, you really get into, especially in the Shelby zone, the utilization of the one school that was rated a 5. That Shelby Middle School was rated a 5, and understanding that school is, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'm going to round and say 60% capacity. And is that the best, most effective and efficient use of our facilities? Okay, if it's not, then how do we do that? If it is, then maybe a change, doesn't need, and that doesn't get into the timeline questions, but that gets into how do we best use those facilities and provide those educational opportunities for our students. Sixth grader in middle school, you're going to add more elective opportunities on the wheel. You're going to add additional specials. You've got the athletic pieces. So there's, again, it's a process. I will address, you mentioned the Kings Mountain intermediate school concept there, and that's a part of the facilities assessment. At this point, you do have to look at space and to be able to say, if you do something in that arena, what do you have the space, and do you have to add additional classrooms? Do you have to add on that type of thing? So I think it's important that we look at that from a holistic perspective, but also we look at it and say, what's best for the students in this zone? How do we impact and use these facilities, and then be able to step out and zoom from a 50,000-foot view, but also zoom into a more targeted approach from what we're doing. So again, I think it's great questions, and I appreciate that. I appreciate the questions about the timeline, because that does, it is, there is a sense of urgency there.
Mr. Blunt?
Well, I sort of look at it this way. If we're going to follow their guidelines, then we should follow their guidelines, at all zones. Don't start picking and choosing zones. I'd like for us to stick to that. If the other zones, when they go and check them out, if we need to do, then we need to follow pursuit. That's what we're paying them to give us their expertise, as long as they follow their expertise and don't follow something that Danny Blanton said, because Danny Blanton might send him down the wrong rabbit road. And but we listen to them. But if we're going to do it at one zone, then we need to take in preparation that we're in the future plans whenever. We can't do it all at one time. There's no question about that. But if we're going to move, then we need to keep our plan in place and keep the ball rolling until we get everything utilized the way it should be. Okay, I'm done.
Just one follow-up. This is an option that we could do. There's not like this is option 1, and we have another option 2 that we only close one school and keep the intermediate. This is what the option is.
I think this is the recommendation. You know, we will work at the discretion of the board in terms of, okay, here's what we want to do, and then we can go back and create new options. This is through our discussion to be able to say, if you're going to, and I hate to go back and drive everything back to the utilization of Shelby Middle School, but if we're going to fully utilize Shelby Middle School, then that drives the fact that you got to put sixth graders there. So if you put sixth graders there, then where does that domino fall? So if it's the decision of the board that no, we want to keep the 5-6 intermediate school, okay, then and that becomes a new guiding principle. Then okay, then you bring in a new set of recommendations that you didn't consider early on. So I think that's, you know, given the considerations of facilities, given the considerations of you know, what's, you know, the total picture, it was, okay, let's look at the Shelby Middle School. How do we increase that enrollment? How do we put students there? How do we best use that capacity? And then those things kind of domino out. But, you know, it's not like there's only one option. There's one recommendation at this point, given the principles that we have. But if those principles change, then obviously, then you would have, could have different opportunities. You know, they're began with multiple, you know, different options, and talking through that, it's kind of like, okay, does this align with where we want to go? If it doesn't, well, then let's scrap that one and move. And so then you get to a recommendation that kind of aligns to where you need to be.
Anything else for Dr. Fisher? Okay. We are to our public hearing section. Just as a reminder to folks that this meeting is to discuss the Shelby Zone realignment, so please limit your comments and questions to that subject. And this will be very similar to our traditional public participation. We'll have 3 minutes for each speaker. You can make comment to the board. You can ask questions. If you have questions, we'll note those questions. And as soon as you finish, as soon as your 3 minutes are finished, then we'll address those questions at that time. And so far, we have one speaker that has signed up. That's Ms. Nanette Leonhardt.
Hey, how's everybody doing?
Just fine.
Okay. I've lived in Cleveland County all my life, except for maybe 4 years. So I'm taxpayer and stakeholder. I've had 33 years of data, research, and statistics. I don't compare to these guys, though. But my question is, on page 6, that is where these schools are identified by their year. I don't know what year Jefferson was built. Now, in my statistics, I never left anything blank. I've worked with federal government contracts, 5 different contracts, the Census Bureau for 30 years. That's every 10 years. And another question, I'm just bringing up. Yeah, it's blank, if I'm not mistaken. Am I? Okay. It's just blank. I just wonder, all the other schools are there. Now, we need that information. And let's see, I think most of the questions were kind of answered tonight, but let me see. On page, I think it's 6. No, I'm sorry. Page 15. I think that's the last page. And my question is, it's not been talked about, well, it's been talked about, but maybe not too much, about properties not used because of improvements within the Shelby attendance zone. Consider selling or otherwise disposing of properties. And I think that question is probably going to be answered, you know, pretty soon. And let me see. And I think that's pretty much well it. Okay, thank you. Thank you, guys.
add that to the list of questions. We'll also get that to our partners at McMillan Pasden Smith. They can update their presentation. The presentation that they made tonight will be on board docs, and if folks go to our website, click on Board of Education, you go to Board Docs Public thing, that presentation is there on tonight's agenda, and then we'll get that updated with the correct information from the date Jefferson was built.
And as far as disposal of properties, our traditional procedure is to go, we have to involve the county, typically involve the city, talk opportunities there, and continue on, possibly going to a bid process.
Your thing.
I'm sorry. Traditionally, when we dispose of properties, we do contact the county because they own all our buildings. We'll also talk with the city, see if they have any uses, and then if they don't, we'll go the traditional route, I assume. But there will be a lot of discussion and possibly a committee formed to handle that.
That's correct.
All right. We have you down for some wrap-up. And then,
Wait a minute. Are we going to ask them, does anybody else have to speak? Did they know they had to sign up?
there was a sign-up sheet at the front door. So there was only one.
Oh, so nobody else wanted
Yeah.
to speak? Well, I got a question.
Yep. All right, let's, time out, let's do this. Is there anyone else that would like to address the board? Is there just one? Okay, come on down, ma'am. Yes, if you'd tell us your name, just so we have that.
I'm Claire Mangione, and I just appreciate all the work that you guys have done and everything. I guess one of my questions would be about Shelby and just what a great local community that we have. And this is, with all due respect to you guys, just, I know at least from what I can tell that Holland and Hamrick is one local architect that wasn't consulted. And I'm just kind of curious why we didn't have local architects on this. Maybe people that were, again, no offense to you guys, but people more invested in these buildings that would be left behind if we go to this new model. So that would be one question. And then also, I'm just curious if our neighbors around Graham and our neighbors around Marion, do they all know that this is going on? You know, in our world where people get their news from Facebook or maybe nowhere, I mean, I'm worried about some of those houses because it's sort of painted as, well, you know, somebody's going to want to buy this building. Well, who? And I mean, especially Graham is at least sort of close to Uptown, and maybe because it's flatter, would lend itself to being broken up into offices. But I am concerned what business is going to move into Marion. Who's going to want that? So those are my two big ones.
Okay.
Well, actually, I would like to also add, I appreciate what Mr. Glover said. I mean, just for teachers in this environment right now, what a horrible couple of years for them. And they're just stressed out of their minds. It just seems like unless Marion and Graham are crumbling to the ground at this very moment, could we just kind of think about it a little bit longer, give them a chance to catch their breath, let them be able to go to Disney World this summer and not worry about moving their classrooms and learning new curriculum. That's it.
Okay, thank you. I can address the first question about using a local architect. When we started the facilities assessment, we did issue a request for proposals. That is open to anyone that would like to respond. And with my past experience with Holland and Hamrick, this is just not in their framework of services that they provide. And so that's why we didn't have anyone locally to do that. I don't think we had any local responses on the request. Dr. Fisher, can you address any announcements that have been made or that would help folks around Graham and Marion know that this is a proposal?
Well, I do know that, you know, we've obviously discussed this in public meetings. We've had multiple conversations with school staff, you know, So we've not gone and done a canvas of the folks in that area. I have talked to people that live in those, especially in the Marion zone, around Marion School. I've had conversations with some of those people in that community with that information. So that's kind of the process in terms of we did put in the paper as required about public hearing that's going on and use our traditional methods of getting that information out.
So I want to give one last call if there's anyone that would like to address the board.
I'd like to address Dr. Fisher.
Okay, go ahead.
I've had several calls and seen a lot on Facebook. I would like, I don't mind saying it, or I don't know if Dr. Fisher wants to, but he's there. He can verify what I'm fixing to say. Our chair brought this up just a second ago. On our facilities, this board cannot sell anything, not one thing, unless it goes through the county. And if the county turns it down, they send us a letter that we don't want it, y'all move forward. Well, over at Kings Mountain, on the sales of those properties at Grover and Kings Mountain Central School.
Mr. Blanton, that's getting off subject. We're on Shelby's Zone tonight.
Well, they asked the question about selling, and I think the people ought to know that we cannot, this board cannot sell anything unless, and they was offered the opportunities and they did not want it. And just like on any of these schools, if it comes up for sale, it goes through them. We cannot sell anything unless they have turned it down and everything, and then and the board moves forward then. And I think the people in this whole county needs to know that this board just don't up and sell something. They can't, under no circumstance.
You're correct. Yeah, duly. Any last call for anyone in the audience that has a comment? Do you need to wrap up anything else? Yeah, I'm glad we don't pay you by the hour tonight.
Wooden floors. Really, not any additional information other than, obviously, a lot of information for the board to digest. We'll have this conversation on our February agenda, board meeting. I would encourage not just board members, but community members, staff members, anyone with questions to contact. We continue to leave the question option open there for people to submit questions. We'll update that FAQ as we can. We have Mr. George here with the STAR, so we'll continue to work and get something, make sure that information's out with people to be able to submit that. And then we're just looking for some direction as far as the next steps to take. If there's other suggestions, other ideas, we're definitely open to look at that. We'll work with, and I appreciate McMillan Pazin Smith being back here tonight, as we take things back to the drawing board and look for different guiding principles that we need to address. So nothing other than that, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I did want to thank the Cleveland Early College High School. They provided some homemade treats for the board before our meeting tonight. This is Board of Education Appreciation Month. The treats were homemade by Miss Jules Hucks. They were very good. We tried several, so we want to thank those folks for doing that. And do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Motion.
Second.
All right, got a first and a second. A motion and a second. All in favor of adjournment? All right. Thank you, folks.